This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. In this episode, Carius witnesses suicidal madness. Let's begin. Our time in the Narva area was thus brought to a close. At the end of April, the company received the order to follow our battalion to the area around Pleskau. Pleskau is the traffic junction on the Leningrad-Donneberg Road. It lies directly south of Lake Pleskau, which stretches north toward Lake Peipus. From Silima, we set out to the west to our railhead. Even without the direct intervention of the enemy, one can still have a lot of headaches with a tank. The infamous rain and mud period had arrived, and even the road was barely negotiable. The wheeled vehicles sank up to their axles, and we were afraid that our tanks would sink to their hulls. Every Tiger had 1 to 2 trucks in tow. The trucks couldn't move forward using their own power. The mud dammed up in front of the radiators. If the tow cable was strong enough, it ripped out the truck's front axle along with its wheels. When we finally arrived at the train station, most of the vehicles were ready for the repair shop. The bulk of them had to be towed onto the rail cars. We looked forward to the train trip. We could stretch out on the straw in the cars for the enlisted men and finally sleep undisturbed for the first time in a long time. We didn't anticipate any alerts at all during the trip. We therefore took good advantage of the time, since no one knew what awaited us in the area around Pleskau. Of course, I had also taken our company dog Hasso along with us, but when I woke up at a stop, he had disappeared. According to accounts from the men, he had jumped out of the moving train, probably to fetch something that somebody had thrown out. I thus lost a good friend whom I sorely missed, even if he was only the 4-legged kind. The battalion had reserved a village for us where we were supposed to draw quarters. It appeared we were supposed to enjoy a few weeks of quiet. This fact didn't sink in on me until the new commander, Major Schwanner, paid us a visit shortly after our arrival. At the time, we didn't know him. He asked me to draw up training schedules for the next 4 weeks. That didn't go down too well with me. I was of the opinion that the men should first recuperate from the long, difficult operations. Naturally, even in a rearward rest position, the necessary duties still had to be performed during the day, but I really had no patience at all for gunnery instruction and similar nonsense, especially since there were no green troops among us. Amazingly enough, the rest didn't do me any good. I found out that even with the best intentions, there are limits to physical stamina. I got asthma attacks, which soon became so severe that I had to stop after every step. I could only move about with a Wolchow walking stick. The battalion physician, Dr. Schonbeck, looked after me. I was ordered to bed and was allowed neither tobacco nor alcohol. The fact that I also didn't have any desire for them told me how really bad off I was. But after a week, I had recovered enough so that I could again carry out route reconnaissance missions toward the front. We had to inspect the roads and bridges in our new area behind the front lines. We also had to establish contact with the troops in their positions so that we knew our way about in case we were employed there. For our operations in the Narva sector, I had been awarded the Knight's Cross on May 4th. The company claimed that I had become sick only to be able to get out of the battalion formation, which had been scheduled for me. The award was therefore brought to me in my billets. The guys drank to my health, while the commander kept an eye on me so that I didn't partake of any alcohol. Everyone shared my happiness. They knew that I would be there when we went to our next operation. 2 new officers, Lieutenants Neinstedt and Eichhorn, arrived a few days later to relieve me. The state of my health had improved noticeably. Based on the peaceful situation in that sector of the front, I was granted a 4-week convalescent leave. As is well known, however, one should never count his chickens before they are hatched. I was barely home for 5 days when a telegram summoned me back to the unit. The frontline soldier must always be prepared for such eventualities. In wartime, usually only the soldiers in the occupied territories were able to enjoy an uninterrupted leave, even though they were already quite well off while in action there. One gets the impression that these privileged men are the ones who complain the most now about the miserable army and the horrible war. Among their ranks today, one also finds those who discriminate against the decent German soldiers and spinelessly support the consciously directed hate from other countries. In Riga, on the trip back to the front, I met Lieutenant Schurer from the 3rd Company. He had received the same telegram as I did. He cursed up a storm and probably didn't even notice how happy I was to have some company on the trip. That made the sudden departure from home easier. When we both arrived at our destination train station and asked about our units, we found out that they had already been moved somewhere else. We then looked up Hauptmann Schmidt, the commander of an assault gun battalion whom we both knew. He promised to put a Kubel and a driver at our disposal, which would take us to our units. At the time, however, he wanted to party with us. We were thus able to drown our sorrows about the leave being cut short. The carousing was so high-spirited that we weren't even aware of our departure. We didn't come back to our senses until we stopped in front of the battalion command post. Instead of an enemy attack awaiting us there as we had assumed, there was another party. Schurer had been promoted to Oberleutnant. We thus had all sorts of reasons to wash down our anger. Our comrades had summoned us back from leave without any type of operation ahead of us that would have demanded it. The next day, I drove to the company. It was quartered a fair distance away in a village. At first, the first sergeant didn't recognize me at all. He was about to salute by the book because he thought I was a new officer who had been transferred to the company. The mistake was soon rectified. Happy to see each other, we shook hands. It should be noted that I had brought back a new and completely regulation overseas cap from leave. It greatly changed my customary appearance. Up to then, I had always worn a form of headgear that bore no resemblance to that in the regulations. It had been sent to me by my mother at the time I was promoted to lieutenant. Since then, the cap had become completely washed out, more gray than black. It sat quite well on my head and didn't have an eagle or a cockade anymore. They had fallen off over time. It had always been a sore point with my battalion and company commanders. Despite numerous requests, however, I could not separate myself from my old cap. It had always served me well and sat so comfortably on my head that the headphones didn't bother me. Even during a heavy storm, I didn't have to worry about losing it, but this was a new field cap. I only wore it in the rear area, however. As soon as I put on my old assault cap, my men knew what was going on. The first sentry who saw me immediately woke up the crews. He knew for certain that things would be happening shortly. I had the opportunity during my first night back to pack my official cap in my trunk. That was because the Russians had broken through at Ostro, south of Pleskow. I could be grateful to them that they had waited for my return. We rolled out in the early morning hours. We reached the Rossitan-Pleskow Rollbahn and approached the area of our operations. Ivan had broken through from the east toward the Rollbahn and controlled it. We were supposed to immediately force him back with a counterattack. We arrived at the infantry command post exactly 15 minutes before the start of the attack. As always, I sat outside the turret with the gunner during our move. I was to the left of and next to the cannon. By doing that, we could see better in the darkness and help the driver. In the process, I had apparently nodded off and suddenly tumbled past the driver's hatch and onto the road. Once again, luck was on my side. My driver, Baresh, reacted as quickly as lightning and braked before the track could grab me. Without his presence of mind, I would have died a less than glorious death. Unfortunately, a messenger had worse luck than I did. He passed a tank and cut in front of it to turn right. When he lost control because of a pothole, he was run over and killed. Major Schwanner, our new commander, was participating in his first operation with the entire battalion. He was very proud to have all of his companies together and went to the regimental command post to discuss the operation. It wasn't as easy to talk to Schwanner as it was with the unforgettable Yada. I had already clearly stated it was impossible to begin the attack at 8 a.m. I urgently requested that the time be postponed until at least 9 a.m. Schwanner had a different opinion. He soon came back from the command post, and despite my misgivings, we had to move immediately. The entire operation was thus condemned to failure from the very beginning. The coordination among the commanders was of secondary importance. It was important, however, that the tankers be given the opportunity to establish contact with the leaders of the infantry units. They had to agree upon the measures needed to work together with us. There was no time left for that, and the results were soon apparent. After a short distance, the infantry went to ground and were not seen anymore. In their inexperience, the men had bunched together like grapes behind and next to the tanks. That drew the fire of the Russians' heavy weapons and resulted in the infantry suffering heavy casualties. Those who had not been wounded threw themselves to the ground to the left and right. Naturally, with the heavy fire, none of them dared to get up again. It was a complete mess. None of us knew a single one of the officers, and no one knew who actually belonged to whom. It was thus practically of no value that we reached the objective with our tanks. At the onset of darkness, we had to evacuate the position because we had no opportunity to mop up the Russian trenches and occupy them ourselves. Ivan was quite aware of that and didn't make any efforts to withdraw. He remained in his bunkers in front of us, feeling quite safe. The high ground from which our people had been tossed off was called quite simply the Judenaise, or Jew's Nose. Readers with some misgivings needn't take offense at this designation. It had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It simply said something about the shape of the high ground in terms that everyone could understand. The Judenaise was fortified in such a manner that it continues to remain a mystery to me how it could have been lost. The Russians had taken it in a raid at night. This reverse can only be explained by the presumed carelessness of our men, who felt too secure and hadn't been alert. The ridgeline rose steeply. The most direct way to it led through a narrow defile, perhaps 50 meters long. Only one tiger could fit in it. To the left and the right of the defile were trench systems, which were arranged in a terraced format along the slope up to the crest. The trenches, which connected the bunkers with one another, were dug into the hill and must have been completely safe against direct fire. The Russians had a reversed front in this defensive system. We had a detailed fortifications map at our disposal, and thus knew the location of every bunker and trench. I was supposed to conduct a frontal attack with the company. At the same time, the rest of the battalion, almost at full strength after its rest and refitting, was to advance to the right of us on a ridgeline that ran into the Judenaise. That would have meant that the entire battalion would have assembled there, one tank after another, to become an easy target for the Russian artillery. That, of course, provided another opportunity for a falling out with the commander. He was already ill-disposed to me because of my objections to the start time of the attack. I said that I considered it nonsense to attack such a small objective with the entire battalion. For this operation, one company would have sufficed completely. If it had been up to me, I would have taken 4 tanks with me, and another 4 tanks would have advanced along the ridgeline so that no more than 8 tanks could have been lost. If those 8 tanks couldn't do it, then neither could the entire battalion, because the vehicles would have interfered with each other's fields of fire. My arguments were not accepted, and I was dressed down. According to the lessons taught by the sand table, the entire battalion just had to be employed. Unfortunately, I couldn't change any of that. One always had a good feeling, however, when there were still a few vehicles held in reserve that could recover the others. I drove off quickly and reached the defile ahead of the others. We weren't in the best of moods while moving through there. Ivan could toss shaped charges down upon us with very little effort from the trenches and the upper edge of the defile. Each of us had to watch out for the others in order to avoid a gigantic mess. We arrived at the military crest without problems, however. 2 tanks had turned off to the left at the foot of the Judenaise. They followed a trail that ran diagonally along the slope to the crest and reached the edge of a patch of woods, at the other end of which we were located. I had scarcely stuck my nose over the crest, however, when I heard a decent-sized round rush past me. That made it appear advisable to remain on the backside of the crest. I later discovered that Ivan had set up assault guns and artillery not far in front of the far side of the slope. They completely dominated the crest. Any advance would have been suicide. Besides, we had reached our former positions. They only needed to be occupied. Our infantry was kilometers to the rear, however, and appeared to be sleeping. In any case, I didn't see a single infantryman for the rest of the day. In the meantime, the rest of the battalion approached us from the right. Although I was in radio contact with the battalion commander, my own boss, he hit me from the right with an anti-tank round between the glacis plate and the turret. He had gone with the other group. The round knocked the wind out of our sails. If he had aimed a little bit more to the left, none of us would probably have had enough time to get out a single curse. Fortunately, he finally recognized us, and the matter stopped with just the one hit. He simply couldn't understand how I had already reached my objective. Lieutenant Naumann, a new man in the battalion and in combat for the first time, drove at high speed at the front of the Kampfgruppe to the right. He stood exposed in the turret and could be seen down to his belt buckle. That sort of thing had nothing to do with boldness. It was suicidal madness. The life of the crew was also irresponsibly placed on the line. I immediately switched over to his company's frequency and continuously transmitted that he should drive more slowly and be more careful. When none of that helped, I gave him the exact distance he still had to drive before Ivan saw him and knocked him out. I could observe everything after all, and knew how far forward we dared to go. But Naumann didn't hear, or he simply didn't want to hear. He got up to the place I had specified and promptly received a devastating direct hit. His tank disappeared from view for a short time. His crew became the only one listed as missing in our battalion. No one in the tank came back. None of us approached the Tiger because it was in the middle of extremely heavy enemy fire. How could a tank commander sacrifice his crew so senselessly? I could not comprehend it then. Even today, I still cannot understand the actions of that young comrade. The 3rd Company had recently received a new company commander, Hauptmann Leonhard. We were lucky and won the grand prize with him. Leonhard was the kind of man whom everyone wants to have as a company commander. I owe him a lot of thanks. He always helped me, the little lieutenant, whenever I wanted to convince the commander of something for the company. There we were, on the crest of the hill, waiting for our infantry. Actually, only the optimists among us waited because the infantry usually didn't follow. If we wanted them to come along, we had to take them with us during the advance. At any rate, these men had taken such heavy losses in wounded that they would not have been strong enough to hold the position through the night. The Russians fired with increasing frequency and accuracy. Their observers probably sat in the trenches behind us to the left. They had simply stayed in their positions because they had no reason to give up ground to us. What could we have done to them? We thus lost one tank after another, especially in the right-hand battle group, which was in an even more disadvantageous position than we were. Von Wesley, who was all the way on the left on the far side of the little patch of woods, soon reported that he had received a hit in the turret from an assault gun that rendered him combat ineffective. Von Wesley had moved up to engage the enemy and give us a little breathing space. The Russians were sharp, however, and didn't even let him get off a shot. He had barely stuck his nose over the crest when a muzzle report was heard. After 4 tanks in the right-hand group, one of mine, and then that of Wesley had become disabled, the commander pulled back with the rest of his Tigers to fetch the infantry. I was supposed to hold the crest for as long as was needed. During the day, we could still do that even though we saw Ivan being continuously reinforced and above all, becoming quite lively to our rear. We wouldn't have had any chance at all at night. At the onset of darkness and without waiting for orders, I decided to drive back through the defile. No human in his right mind could have demanded that I remain there overnight with the 3 remaining combat-ready tanks, or that I try to get back through the defile in complete darkness. We made it through that dangerous area without incident, and also picked up the crew of Lieutenant Eichhorn en route. His vehicle wouldn't start anymore, and no one had looked out for him. That meant that yet another Tiger was left in the open, a really depressing conclusion to our efforts. When I finally arrived at the jumping-off position, I discovered that none of the infantry entertained thoughts about coming forward that night. I was thus thoroughly pleased with my decision not to remain there. Major Schwanner didn't raise any objections and probably realized that I had been right with my moaning and groaning in the morning. Everyone has to pay dearly for experience. In the early morning hours of the next day, we brought our infantry halfway up to the Judenassi so it would have a shorter distance to our objective. The men formed a skirmish line there and were able to occupy the old positions with the remaining forces without any problems. The terrain was somewhat flat, but wooded in places, and good camouflage was possible. To the left of the trail that led to the Judenays, we could see a ridgeline about 800 meters away which ran parallel to us. A Russian attack was in progress there. I could observe the close-quarters combat with my binoculars and immediately fired into Ivan's flank. That helped our guys somewhat. The Russian lines ran into a depression halfway to the left in front of us. They were about a kilometer away and could be easily seen from above. The Russians moved about in such a happy-go-lucky manner that we had to fire off a few rounds to make them be more careful. Their brazenness was often amazing. Around noon, they drove with their prime movers, artillery pieces, and ammunition trailers onto the open area of the forward slope, as if we didn't exist at all. We let them advance far enough down so that they couldn't quickly disappear over the crest, and then lobbed a few rounds in front of them. The distance was too great to hit with any accuracy, and the drivers were able to save themselves before we hit their transportation and their tractors burned. The Russians realized that we had redeployed, and they abstained from attacking that day. It was clear that they were going to reinforce their positions on the Judenes. They could certainly count on us attacking a second time. In the final analysis, the retaking of these fortifications was absolutely essential to us. The front to the left and right of us could not be held otherwise. The high ground we had lost dominated the terrain completely. It absolutely had to be retaken. This concludes the 17th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.